Well, welcome back. We are still reading chapter 5 in Joe Campbell's Primitive Mythology. I think I'm going to finish chapter 5 this time. Yeah, I think so. All right, let's get started. An excellent South American example of the same mythologem was recorded by Theodor Koch-Grünberg during his expedition to the jungles of the upper Amazonian basin in the years 1903 to 1905. Primitive as the people of that almost impenetrable green hell appear, and savage as they certainly are, they cultivate a number of food plants, the most important of which is manioc, cassava, a vegetable containing a lethal poison, hydrocyanic acid, which has to be removed by cooking before the nourishing rootstock can be consumed. The women, whose customary costume is their own skin with all body hair removed, plant their manioc in gardens cleared in the jungles by the men, while the latter, whose attire is never more than a meager shred of a string of pubic covering or decoration, hunt, fish, and try to ambush the best-looking women of the neighboring tribes. Besides yielding the staple nourishment of these people and the poison for their blowgun darts, manioc renders a weak yet adequate intoxicant as well, which contributes considerably to the spirit of their dancing feasts. So it is a plant that combines remarkably all the mysteries of the Dema. It is at once life-supporting, death-administering, and spirit-rousing. However, the art of raising, preparing, and enjoying this wondrous plant, from which we, by the way, derive tapioca, is but one of the wonders of the heritage of these jungle inhabitants, who surely cannot be as simple as they seem, for they play at their festivals a large battery of musical instruments by no means primitive, trumpets of bark and of wood, both great and small, clarinets, flutes, and flageolets, ocarinas, panpipes, and a kind of roarer made of a tube blown into a jar, besides the well-known slit-log drums of Frobenius's equatorial zone, and a sort of hollow wooden cylinder upwards of 3 feet long, which is struck end down like a pestle upon the ground. In the legend of the wonderful sun-boy Milomaki, which Professor Koch-Grünberg recorded among the cannibalistic Yahuna, who occupy an area on the left bank of the lower Apaporis River that is practically on the equator, latitude 2 degrees south, and about at the border of Colombia and Brazil, longitude 70 degrees west, we learn of the origin not only of the food plants and first fruits festival of these people, but also of the curious music of the flutes and reeds to the tones of which the rites are celebrated. From the great water-house, the land of the sun, there came many years ago a little boy who sang so beautifully that many people flocked from near and far to see and hear him. And the name of this boy was Milomaki. But when those who had heard him returned to their homes and ate fish, they all died. Hence their relatives seized Milomaki, who meanwhile had grown to young manhood, and because he was so dangerous, having killed their brothers, they cremated him on a great pyre. Nevertheless, the youth continued to sing beautifully to the very end, and even while the flames were licking his body, he was singing, "Now I die, now I die, now I die, my son, now I depart from this world." And when his body was swelling with the heat, he was still singing in glorious tones, "Now my body breaks, now I am dead," and his body burst. He died and was consumed by the flames, but his soul ascended to heaven, while from his ashes there grew that very day a long green blade, which became steadily bigger and bigger, spreading out until the next day it was already a tall tree, the first Paxiuba palm in the world. The people fashioned huge flutes of the wood of this palm and gave forth the same wonderfully beautiful tones, and these gave forth the same wonderfully beautiful tones that formerly had been sung by Milomaki himself. Furthermore, the men blow on such flutes to this day when the fruits are ripe, and they dance while doing so in memory of Milomaki, who is the creator and giver of all fruits. But the women and children must not see these flutes, for if they did, they would die. Ultimately, as we now know, the art of cultivating maize was derived by the North American Indians from either Mexico or Peru, the great centers of high civilization in the New World. And so we shall conclude the present brief sampling of the variant forms of our mythology with an example from the Aztecs. Sir James G. Frazer, in The Golden Bough, supplies an instance from the vivid account of Fray Bernardino de Chahucan. At a great festival in September, which was preceded by a strict fast of 7 days, they sanctified a young slave girl of 12 or 13 years, the prettiest they could find, to represent the maize goddess Chicomecohuatl. They invested her with the ornaments of the goddess, putting a mitre on her head and maize combs round her neck and in her hands, and fastening a green feather upright on the crown of her head to imitate an ear of maize. This they did, we are told, in order to signify that the maize was almost ripe at the time of the festival. But because it was still tender, they chose a girl of tender years to play the part of the maize goddess. The whole long day they led the poor child in all her finery, with the green plume nodding on her head from house to house, dancing merrily to cheer people after the dullness and privations of the fast. In the evening all the people assembled at the temple, the courts of which they lit up by a multitude of lanterns and candles. There they passed the night without sleeping, and at midnight, while the trumpets, flutes, and horns discoursed solemn music, a portable framework or palanquin was brought forth, bedecked with festoons of maize cobs, and peppers, and filled with seeds of all sorts. This the bearers set down at the door of the chamber in which the wooden image of the goddess stood. Now the chamber was adorned and wreathed both outside and inside with wreaths of maize cobs, peppers, pumpkins, roses, and seeds of every kind, a wonder to behold. The whole floor was covered deep with these verdant offerings of the pious. When the music ceased, a solemn procession came forth of priests and dignitaries, with flaring lights and smoking censers, leading in their midst the girl who played the part of the goddess. Then they made her mount the framework, where she stood upright on the maize and peppers and pumpkins with which it was strewed, her hands resting on 2 banisters to keep her from falling. Then the priests swung the smoking censers round her. The music struck up again, and while it played, a great dignitary of the temple suddenly stepped up to her with a razor in his hand and adroitly shore off the green feather she wore on her head, together with the hair in which it was fastened, snipping the lock off by the root. The feather and the hair he then presented to the wooden image of the goddess with great solemnity and elaborate ceremonies, weeping and giving her thanks for the fruits of the earth and the abundant crops which she had bestowed on the people that year. And as he wept and prayed, all the people standing in the courts of the temple wept and prayed with him. When that ceremony was over, the girl descended from the framework and was escorted to the place where she was to spend the rest of the night. But all the people kept watch in the courts of the temple by the light of torches till break of day. The morning being come, and the courts of the people being still crowded by the multitude, who would have deemed it sacrilege to quit the precincts, The priests again brought forth the damsel attired in the costume of the goddess, with the mitre on her head and the cobs of maize about her neck. Again she mounted the portable framework or palanquin, and stood on it, supporting herself by her hands on the banisters. Then the elders of the temple lifted it on their shoulders, and while some swung burning censers and others played on instruments or sang, they carried it in a procession through the great courtyard to the hall of the god Huitzilopochtli, and then back to the chamber where stood the wooden image of the maize goddess, whom the girl personated. There they caused the damsel to descend from the palanquin, and to stand on the heaps of corn and vegetables that had been spread in profusion on the floor of the sacred chamber. While she stood there, all the elders and nobles came in a line, one behind the other, carrying saucers full of dry and clotted blood, which they had drawn from their ears by way of penance during the 7 days' fast. One by one they squatted on their haunches before her, which was the equivalent of falling on their knees with us, and scraping the crust of blood from the saucer, cast it down before her as an offering in return for the benefits which she, as the embodiment of the maize goddess, had conferred upon them. When the men had thus humbly offered their blood to the human representative of the goddess, the women, forming a long line, did so likewise, each of them dropping on her hams before the girl and scraping her blood from the saucer. The ceremony lasted a long time, for great and small, young and old, all without exception, had to pass before the incarnate deity and make their offering. When it was over, the people returned home with glad hearts to feast on flesh and viands of every sort, as merrily, we are told, as good Christians at Easter partake of meat and other carnal mercies after the long abstinence of Lent. And when they had eaten and drunk their fill and rested after the night watch, they returned quite refreshed to the temple to see the end of the festival. And the end of the festival was this: the multitude being assembled, the priest solemnly incensed the girl who personated the goddess. Then they threw her back on the heap of corn and seeds, cut off her head, caught the gushing blood in a tub, and sprinkled the blood on the wooden image of the goddess of the walls, the walls of the chamber, and the offerings of corn, peppers, pumpkins, seeds, vegetables, which cumbered the floor. After that, they flayed the headless trunk, and one of the priests made shift to squeeze himself into the bloody skin. Having done so, they clad him in all the robes which the girl had worn. They put the mitre on his head, the necklace of golden maize cobs about his neck, the maize cobs of feathers and gold in his hands, and thus arrayed, they led him forth in public, all of them dancing to the tuck of drum, while he acted as fugleman, skipping and posturing at the head of the procession as briskly as he could be expected to do, incommoded as he was by the tight and clammy skin of the girl, and by her clothes, which must have been too small for a grown man. No wonder, we may say, if the Spanish padres thought they recognized in the liturgies of the New World a devil's parody of their own high myth and holy mass of the sacrifice and resurrection. One version of the mythological event at the beginning of time, which supplied the model for this rite, tells that as the goddess Tlaltuetli was walking alone upon the face of the primordial waters, a great and wonderful maiden with eyes and jaws at every joint that could see and bite like animals. She was spied by the two primary gods, Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent, and Kotlipoka, the smoking mirror, whereupon, deciding that they should create the world of her, they transformed themselves into mighty serpents and came at her from either side. One seized her from the right hand to the left foot, the other from the left hand to the right foot, and together they ripped her asunder. From the parts they fashioned not only the earth and heavens, but also the gods. And then, to comfort the goddess for what had happened to her, all the gods came down, and paying her obeisance, commanded that there should come from her all the fruits that men require for their life. And so, from her hair they made trees, flowers, and grass, from her eyes springs, fountains, and the little caves, from her mouth rivers and the great caves, from her nose valleys, and from her shoulders mountains. But the goddess wept all night, for she had a craving to consume human hearts, and she would not be quiet until they were brought to her, nor would she bear fruit until she had been drenched with human blood. Well, that ends the chapter on the ritual love-death. I suppose there was a pretty fitting end, given the title of the chapter. Next time, we will start in a new section on the mythology of the primitive hunters, and we'll be reading chapter 6 on shamanism. Thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.